He stood outside the modest apartment building for nearly 20 minutes, unable to move, unable to breathe properly, his hand trembling as he held the envelope that had taken him 5 years and countless sleepless nights to work up the courage to deliver. Robert Sterling had built a business empire worth over $2 billion, had negotiated with world leaders and corporate titans, had stood before audiences of thousands without a single stutter. But standing in front of that weathered door on the 3rd floor of a building in Queens, he felt smaller than he'd ever been in his life. Inside that apartment lived the woman he'd loved more than anything. The woman he'd destroyed with his own ambition and neglect. The woman who had vanished so completely from his world that he'd spent the last 5 years haunted by what he'd done to her. Their marriage had been beautiful once. Robert could still remember the exact moment he'd known he wanted to spend his entire life with Claire. It was in a bookstore in Boston, where she was talking animatedly to a group of customers about a novel she'd read, her eyes shining with passion, her laughter filling the entire section. She was a librarian then, working at a small public library, finding joy in connecting people with stories that changed their lives. Robert was just starting his tech company, still working out of a cramped office, still dreaming of something bigger. But he'd never imagined that bigger would eventually require him to choose his company over her, or that the success he was so desperately chasing would cost him the only person who had ever truly understood him. The divorce had been brutal, not because of fighting over money or possessions, but because of the silence that had followed it. Claire didn't want alimony, didn't ask for anything he offered. She simply wanted out, wanted away from the man who looked at her with recognition in his eyes but was already thinking about the next board meeting, the next venture capital opportunity, the next milestone. When he finally signed the papers 5 years ago, she had simply walked out of the lawyer's office without a backward glance. He'd tried to reach out dozens of times over those 5 years. Emails she never answered, phone calls she let go to voicemail, letters he sent that he never knew if she'd actually read. The silence became deafening, a monument to all the things he'd failed to give her. If you believe in redemption, second chances, and the transformative power of genuine remorse, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. This is a story about what it means to truly understand what we've lost, and what we're willing to sacrifice to make it right. What had finally broken through Robert's denial wasn't a moment of clarity or an epiphany. It was a photograph. He'd been scrolling through his company's annual gala photos when he saw her in the background. Claire, looking thinner than he remembered, with a young girl of about 8 years old holding her hand. There was a man standing next to her, his arm around her protectively, and he was looking at the child with pride and adoration. Robert had felt something shatter inside his chest. Claire had moved on. She had built a life without him, with someone else, with a child who would never know that his mother had once been married to Robert Sterling. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just a divorced man who'd chosen his career over his marriage. He was a ghost in a woman's past, so inconsequential that she had completely rebuilt her world without looking back. That night, Robert did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the library where Claire used to work. She wasn't there anymore, of course, but an older librarian mentioned that she'd transferred to the branch in Queens 5 years ago, around the time of her divorce. Robert had sat in the library for 6 hours, just sitting, surrounded by books, thinking about the woman who had loved literature the way some people loved life itself. He remembered how she used to read passages to him from her favorite novels, how her voice would shift with the different characters, how alive she seemed when talking about stories. He'd been so focused on building something that would last forever that he'd destroyed the one thing that truly mattered, the love of a woman who saw him for who he really was, not for who he was becoming. For weeks, Robert struggled with what to do. He considered simply showing up at her apartment, but realized how unfair and intrusive that would be after so much silence. He thought about writing a letter, but nothing he wrote felt adequate, felt true enough to express what 5 years of regret and longing had carved into his soul. Finally, he decided on something different. He hired a private investigator not to stalk her, but to understand her life, to learn what she cared about, what made her happy now, what she needed. What he discovered both broke his heart and gave him hope. Claire was happy. She was a librarian at the Queens branch, loved by her patrons and colleagues. She'd adopted the child he'd seen in the photo, a girl named Lucy who'd been in foster care, unwanted and abandoned, just like Claire herself had been abandoned as a child. Claire had always wanted to give a home to someone who needed one, but Robert had said no, wanting to focus on his business first, wanting to wait until they were more financially settled. She'd done it anyway, single without his help, raising that child with love and patience and all the tenderness he'd failed to give her. The envelope in Robert's hand now contained something he'd worked on for months. It wasn't money. He knew better than to insult her with that. Instead, it was something far more valuable. Over the past year, Robert had quietly purchased the abandoned library building 3 blocks from where Claire worked. He'd renovated it completely, transforming it into a state-of-the-art community center and library with the most extensive children's section in all of Queens. Every detail had been designed with Claire in mind. The architecture of the reading nooks, the collection of classic and contemporary literature, the children's spaces decorated with murals from local artists. But more importantly, the building was being donated to the city, with instructions that Claire was to be offered the position of director if she wanted it, with a salary that would finally give her the financial security he'd refused to give their marriage. His hands shook as he finally knocked on the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. He thought perhaps she wasn't home, thought perhaps he'd come on the wrong day, and he almost turned away. Would have turned away, would have convinced himself that she was better off without his intrusion. Then the door opened, and there she was. 5 years had softened her edges, had added lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and struggle and also of joy. She was still beautiful. Still the woman he'd fallen in love with in that bookstore, but changed, stronger somehow, more fully herself. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and Robert could see the questions forming in her eyes, the wariness, the guardedness she'd built as protection against exactly this kind of moment. He didn't give her a chance to close the door or tell him to leave. Instead, he held out the envelope and began to speak. He didn't apologize profusely or try to explain away his failures. He simply told her the truth. He told her that he'd been so focused on building something external that he'd failed to recognize the treasure he already had. He told her that he'd seen her with Lucy, and it had made him understand in a way nothing else could have the kind of person she truly was. Someone who loved deeply, who gave generously, who had the capacity for grace that he'd squandered. He told her that he understood now that he couldn't fix the past, couldn't undo the pain he'd caused, but that he wanted her to know that her kindness, her character, her choice to love a child who needed her had somehow changed him, had finally broken through his ambition long enough to see what really mattered. Claire opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were blueprints, photos of the renovation, and a letter explaining everything. As she read, tears began to stream down her face, not tears of joy, but tears of release, as if she'd been holding something inside for 5 long years and finally had permission to let it go. She looked up at Robert, and for the first time in 5 years she spoke his name. She didn't say she forgave him, didn't say everything was okay, but she invited him inside, and he sat in her modest living room surrounded by shelves of books and watched as she read through every detail he'd created for her. Lucy came home from school that afternoon and was cautiously introduced to a man her mother called an old friend, and Robert found himself playing board games and hearing about third-grade drama and watching how Claire's entire face transformed when she looked at this child she'd chosen to love. By the end of the evening, Claire hadn't forgiven him completely, but something had shifted. The silence that had existed between them for 5 years had finally broken, not with words or promises, but with one gesture that showed Robert truly understood what he'd lost and who he'd wronged. What happened next was slow, careful, and genuine. Over the following weeks, Robert became a quiet presence in their lives, helping with repairs, attending Lucy's school events, being present in a way he'd never been before. He didn't expect Claire to love him again, didn't expect a second chance at their marriage. He simply wanted to be part of her world in whatever way she would allow. If this story reminded you of the power of genuine remorse, of making amends in a way that truly honors the person you've hurt, please engage with this video. Like it, share it, and tell us your own stories of redemption in the comments below. Have you ever had someone make a gesture that showed they truly understood what they'd taken for granted? Have you ever found it in yourself to forgive? We'd love to hear from you. The new library center opened 6 months later, and Claire became its director, overseeing a thriving community space that served thousands of people each year. She and Robert never rekindled their romantic relationship, but they became something perhaps even more meaningful, friends who had learned through painful experience the true value of seeing and honoring the people we love. And Robert, finally, free from the prison of ambition, discovered that the greatest success wasn't measured in billions of dollars, but in the quiet moment when someone you've hurt looks at you with recognition and allows you back into their life. Not as the person you were, but as the person you've finally chosen to become. If you've made it this far, we want to hear from you. Please comment below and share what this story means to you. Did it touch your heart? Did it remind you of someone? Let's build a community of people who believe that it's never too late to change, to make amends, and to finally get our priorities right.